What up, y'all? Welcome back to another gszn reaction video. Hopefully, y'all having a blessed day. Today, we're finna react to the rise of single mothers in black households in America. Make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe if you're new. And yeah, let's get straight on to the video.
You're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so when you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Thomas Sowell was such a gem, man. For real. He's a national treasure.
Most black children were being raised in two-parent families in 1960. 30 years after the liberal welfare state, the great majority of black children were being raised by single parents.
Yes.
How does that, by the way, we should note that Patrick Moynihan publishes the Moynihan Report in 1965.
Yes.
And he's alarmed because the illegitimacy rate among black families is 25% then. Now, among whites, it's over a third.
Yes.
Hispanics, it's over half. And among African Americans, it's over 70%. What's going on there?
Well, this is again. This too, you find the same thing in Britain. You find it in France and Norway. You find it in the Western world. In fact,
The dissolution of the family structure.
oh yeah, there are any number of Western nations where 40% of the children are raised with only one parent.
Right.
At the extremes, compared to Asian countries, at the extremes, Iceland, it's 2 out of 3 children born are raised in a single-parent home. In South Korea, it's 1 out of 66.
Wow. Wow. And so, that's the welfare state?
Yes.
It is.
Oh, you're paying. You're creating a situation where if the first of all, you're creating a situation where if the man stays there, the government will not give the woman welfare, and if he leaves, it will. And so when you pay people not to get married, more people don't get married.
Quote, Black Americans, a group often identified as beneficiaries of the welfare state in America, made considerable economic progress in the 20th century. Fine, of course, but much, if not most. This is the thing with you, the dependent clause is where the sting is. But much, if not most, of this progress was prior to the massive expansion of the American welfare state, close quote. That is so I want to say counterintuitive because we hear so much about African-American progress since civil rights and the establishment of the welfare state that it really has become a kind of American intuition. Explain yourself, Dr. Sowell.
Well, as of 1940, 87% of black households were in poverty. Over the next 20 years, that declined to 47%. This is all prior to the civil rights laws, prior to the social welfare policies of the Johnson administration. Over the next 20 years, it fell an additional 18 points. But that was just the same trend continuing at a reduced rate. Affirmative action is even worse because, as I remember, I'm trying to think now, the numbers. I think it was something like, poverty rate was something like 30% among black households before affirmative action. And a decade after affirmative action, it was 29%. This is not the same as the 40% decline that occurred before there were any civil rights laws and before there was any social welfare state.
And so what happened between 1940 and 1960 was the post-Second World War economic boom.
It was
right?
but it was also the massive migration of blacks out of the South.
So they're getting better education and jobs.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you mention cultural and social retrogressions. Again, I'm quoting you. Arguably the most consequential of these was the decline in two-parent families.
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that one. Among African Americans.
Yes.
We're still talking about African Americans.
Well, you know, when they talk about things like this, they talk about the legacy of slavery.
Right, right.
And I argue, well, empirically, it's not that, it's the legacy of the welfare state. Because as of 1960, which is almost 100 years after slavery ended, the majority of black kids were being raised in two-parent households. But within one generation after the welfare state, that had dropped down to a minority. So that the majority of black kids today are raised in one-parent households. When you think about it, I mean,
Yeah, I feel like the welfare is a psychological trap.
centuries of slavery and generations of Jim Crow did not destroy the black family, but one generation of the welfare state did.
The Moynihan Report, what was it, a call for national action?
Yes.
The Negro family, a call for national action, 1965, and even
Right.
50 years ago. And his principal point of alarm, and again now,
Did y'all hear the numbers? 70%. That's a high number. So it did some damage, man.
I'm trying to recall the statistics, but I believe the out-of-wedlock birth rate among African Americans in 1965 was 25%.
Something like that, yeah.
And he was so alarmed that he wrote this report, and today it's over 70%. And by
Yes.
the way,
Wow.
the rate among whites is over 1/3 at this stage.
Yes.
So how does the family breakdown fit into an economic understanding? Is it simply the social breakdown of the American family is something that we have to understand aside from the tools of economics? It just doesn't fit into supply and demand curves and
certainly
economic history?
this occurred at a time when the black income was rising. And so we're saying that previous generations of blacks with lower income and more racial barriers the family stuck together under those conditions. And under the new conditions, which were advertised to make for great progress, in fact created retrogressions. And I think many people who were gung-ho for the idea that this was going to be progress simply cannot bring themselves to look at the evidence and say, my God, we made things worse.
Economic facts and fallacies. A fallacy
Yeah, that is true. And also, when gangster rap was emerging around the 1980s, 1990s, that that led to fathers getting locked up and going to prison. This increased crime rates, drug use, and drug dealing, which resulted in single mothers taking care of their children by themselves. And so these children were getting raised with no father figure, no role model, and no leaders. I feel like the gangster rap hip hop culture also affected the black household. It damaged the black household.
is that the current fatherless family so prevalent among contemporary blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, close
Yes.
quote. Explain that.
You mean explain why it is so, or
Yeah, see, why is that? What on earth is going on?
And now we have a culture where we normalize baby mamas. It's getting worse and worse every time, man. And nowadays, it's still happening to this day. We are in black communities. There's not enough leaders and role models for the youth.
On there that is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first of all, most people have not recognized the fact that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among blacks then than today. You find also, incidentally, that the blacks had, as late as 1930, blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present.
Right.
But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
Oh, you began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
And so, but why? Well, illegitimacy is exploding now it's high among Hispanics,
Yes.
and it's exploding among whites. But the Moynihan report, when was that, Tom?
Or in
It
the
was
60s, 64, 65. I
when
believe.
Moynihan talked about the illegitimacy rate among
Yes.
blacks, which was exploding then. So what if the welfare state changes the way Americans think?
Yes.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, well, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
Nothing so turns the tables on critics of social pathology in the
They were broke. The family was broke, man. Mothers needed money. So that's why I said it was a psychological trap. Because what that did, right, was the single parents received government assistance. And so they developed a mindset of not needing the fathers in their household, and that they didn't rely on them because all the fathers were getting locked up and gone in jail. So what that does, right, is the children do not have a father figure, and when they grow up, it will be hard for them. Let's just say that it will be hard for them to survive in the world, because in a household, both parents are extremely important. You need the father for discipline, and you need the mother to nurture the child. So yeah, it is sad to see that it's still happening in today's world.
black community as invoking the painful history of slavery. But because slavery has left bitter legacies, it does not follow that any particular bitter experience among blacks today can automatically be attributed to slavery. Cancer is indeed fatal, but every fatality cannot be attributed to cancer, and certainly not after an autopsy has shown death to be due to a heart attack or gunshot wounds. One of the key misfortunes within the contemporary black community, from which many other misfortunes flow, is the breakdown of the family, or the failure to form a family in the first place. As of 1992, more than half of all black adults had never been married, quite aside from an additional 16% who had been either divorced or widowed. By contrast, only 21% of white adults had never been married. More than half of all black children, 57%, were living with only one parent, and another 7.5% were not living with either parent.
Y'all hear those numbers? 50%. That's half. That's high, man.
Thus, only a little
And I'm gonna be honest with y'all. Even myself too. I grew up with a single mother in the household, and yeah, it was very hard. It was very hard, but I want to make that change. I want to stop that curse of single parenthood in the household. For real, man.
Little more than a third of black children were living in traditional two-parent households. The great majority of those black children who were living with only one parent were living with their mothers, and more than half of these mothers were unmarried. The all-too-common and all-too-tragic situation was the teenage mother, children having children. Of 190,000 black children whose parents were currently still teenagers, only 5,000 were living with both parents. This, of course, does not include all those children whose mothers were teenagers when they were born, but whose mothers were 20 years old or older at the time the Census Bureau collected the statistics.
Damn.
In short, it underestimates the extent of teenage motherhood and the consequences that continue long after the mother has reached 20 years of age. Children having children is a deadly situation,
It's deadly.
whether from the standpoint of physical health, babies born to teenage mothers being prone to more medical disabilities, or from the standpoint of the inability or unwillingness of teenage mothers to raise those children with the knowledge, skills, and values necessary for them to become productive and law-abiding adults. Since many of these teenage girls are high school dropouts and are otherwise lacking in the discipline, knowledge, and maturity necessary to raise a child, they can hardly be expected to give the child what they themselves do not have. the tragedy of the situation is too obvious to require elaboration. As in other areas where violations of societal norms have led to disasters, the first order of business for the anointed has been to turn the tables on society, which must itself be made to feel guilty for what it complains of. Blaming a legacy of slavery for the high levels of unwed teenage pregnancy among blacks and the abdication of responsibility by the fathers of the children clearly performs that function. Whether it is actually true is another question, and one receiving remarkably little attention. Going back 100 years, when blacks were just one generation out of slavery, we find that the census data of that era showed that a slightly...
Can we start normalizing having children when you get married? We need to start normalizing that, man. Because as a culture, it's the opposite. It's the opposite, man. People having babies before marriage, teenage pregnancies. Yeah, man. All it's dangerous, man. Dangerous situations.
A higher percentage of black adults had married than had white adults. This, in fact, remained true in every census from 1890 to 1940. Prior to 1890, this question was not included in the census, but historical records and contemporary observations of the Reconstruction era depicted desperate efforts of freed black men and women to find their lost mates, children, and other family members, efforts continuing on for years and even decades after the Civil War. Slavery had separated people, but it had not destroyed the family feelings they had for each other, much less their desire to form families after they were free. As late as 1950, 72% of all black men and 81% of black women had been married, but the 1960 census showed the first signs of a decline that accelerated in later years, as so many other social declines began in the 1960s. This new trend, beginning a century after emancipation, can hardly be explained as a legacy of slavery, and might more reasonably be explained as a legacy of the social policies promoted by the anointed, especially since similar social policies led to similarly high rates of unwed motherhood in Sweden, where neither race nor slavery could be held responsible. Looking more closely at the history of broken homes and female-headed households in the United States, we find that both have long been more prevalent among blacks than among whites, although the differences were not always as dramatic as they are today. The higher levels of broken homes among blacks in the past were due in part to higher mortality rates among blacks, leaving more widows and widowers, but there were also more family breakups. None of this was unique to blacks, however. The Irish went through a similar social history in 19th century American cities. But the female-headed households of an earlier era, whether among blacks or whites, were seldom headed by teenage girls. As of 1940, among black females who headed their own households, 52% were 45 years old or older. Moreover, only 14% of all black children were born to unmarried women at that time. The whole situation was radically different from what it is today. Whatever factors caused the changes, these were clearly 20th century factors, not a legacy of slavery.
Man, that's an amazing video, man. Again, Thomas Sowell is a national treasure, and I would recommend y'all to purchase his books, his merch, anything, man. Support this guy. And like I said in previous videos, I know that generational trauma does exist and it does get passed down genetically and DNA wise. So yeah, we can't say that slavery is not the reason why. I feel like it's both. It's it's the culture and generational trauma. But y'all, hopefully y'all made it to the end of the video. If y'all did, make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe. And yeah, man, I'm gonna catch y'all in the next video. Peace.